So, welcome everyone. My name is Nick Marshall, and I'm the Manager of Exhibitions and Programs at the George Eastman Museum. I want to thank you for joining us today as the museum's landscape manager, Dan Bellavia, takes us on a virtual tour of George Eastman's historic estate. If you have any questions during today's talk, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We ask that you do not submit questions through the chat function. If you'd like to use the chat to say hello, please feel free to do so, but all questions should be submitted to the Q&A section so that we can just more easily monitor them. When Dan is done with his presentation, we'll try and get to as many of your questions as possible. We will be recording today's talk, and it will be available on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. You can check out our YouTube channel for all of our recorded webinars that we've been doing over the past couple of months. And if you'd like to share that with others, you can share that through social media. Our next webinar is going to be on Friday, August 14th at 1 p.m. with Lisa Hostetler, curator in charge of the Department of Photography. Lisa will discuss the recent installation of the History of Photography Gallery, commemorating the ratification of the 19th Amendment. To find out more about that and other programming, please visit our website and scroll down to sign up for our e-newsletter. Now I will turn it over to my colleague, Dan Bellavia.
Thanks, Nick. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a virtual tour through George Eastman's gardens. Okay, so we're speaking about George Eastman today and what he did on his property. Back in 1901, he was living in a house on East Avenue and really wanted to have an estate where he could turn it into a farm. He had been raised as a farm boy and really wanted a large piece of property to become almost a gentleman farmer. So back in 1901, he found a piece of property that was perfect. It was one of the last farms available on East Avenue called the Culver Homestead. A large piece of property that was 8 acres in size, was perfect for what he wanted to do. So in 1902, they began construction of the house, and by 1905, he was ready to move in. Oh, we missed a picture somehow. Hold on here. Oh, let me go forward here. Bear with me because my computer doesn't always listen to me. This is the house. This is what he built. It is obviously a current picture of it. So it looks a lot different. Back when he had it, he had a lot of trees in front of it, and it had a lot of seclusion from the street. We've now opened up it a lot more. This is an earlier picture of the house. So that he had his privacy, he was set back from the road, was able to sit on his porch and be able to enjoy his front yard without being hassled by the people walking by. So to start the tour, we're heading around on the east side of the property, and we come up to what's called the east porch. This is a great entrance coming into his gardens. It's a beautiful little porch. He would sit out and have his coffee, enjoy the day, and be able to stay out of the sun, the heat of the day, as we've been experiencing the last couple of weeks here. And then we would enter into the terrace garden. All right, the terrace garden was built in 1902, 1903 before he was there. This is a layout that was designed by Ailing DeForest. He was a well-known landscape architect at the time, and had given Eastman an idea of how they would end up laying out the house. You can see it's a little tough to see, but this is actually an original drawing showing where the residence was, where all the gardens would be. It does show the west garden because at this point, the garden had been done. This is a later picture of what he had done. But it shows you where his vegetables, shows you where his lawn expanses are, gives you an idea of how his gardens were laid out. So as I said, in 1902, they began construction of the terrace garden. This is an upper view of it. You can see where he had his greenhouses in the background. And at this point, he was still deciding what was going to happen with the gardens. He wasn't quite sure, so there were things being put in. Were put in for a few years, would change. He was notorious for changing what he did have in his gardens. This garden consists of 23 beds, has a pergola structure, which you see off on the right-hand side. It has a loggia. We call it the colonnade now. That is the structure that you see on the left side. And then there is a pointed building next to it that's called the palm house. the two buildings on the left-hand side were able to have windows put in it during the winter months, but he would take them down and be able to grow plants in the palm house, and he was able to entertain people in the colonnade. You see there's a very nice focal point of a lily pond in the center. This lily pond is roughly 3 feet deep, and it did hold water lilies and an assortment of different water plants that he was able to put in. So as I said, this is at the beginning. He was not even living here at the time. You can see some of the destruction material off to the side of the greenhouses. So they weren't ready to actually have him come in, but they were beginning to start planting some of the material. This is a better picture of it once he was there. And as you can see, towards the center left, you'll see little fountains. When he originally started building it, he had put fountains into it because he wanted a water feature to be added with the lily pond that was there. As I said, he changed things very often. I have looked at the original 1902 plans. Unfortunately, I can't get a good image of it for you to see. And I looked at what he had and what he actually planted, and we can see that he didn't follow those plans exactly. So we aren't really sure at this point what plants he was planting, what he was doing. And from successive pictures of this garden, we have found that he never actually stuck with plants every year. He would change it around, continually changing it. He loved gardening. He didn't do a lot of it himself. He did have 13 gardeners to help him do the work, but he was out there being very fastidious about how things looked and what was going to happen. He was notorious for being very picky. Every spring, he would send the gardeners out to look at the rosebuds. If there were less than 13 rosebuds on a shrub, that bush was taken out and was replaced with another one. He wanted certain standards in his gardens. So as time went on, we have seen progressions of how things changed and how he would change things around till 1915 when he did stick with a basic plan that was in here. Here's a better view of it. This is later. This is about 1912, we estimate. One of the problems with our pictures is we're trying to get better and better on dating. At this point, it looks like he's done some new things to the gardens that we know dates of some things that happened. You will see that the bird bath type water fountains have been replaced. They will be replaced with some, what you see in there are called wellheads. Those wellheads are actually 15th century wellheads. It gives you, that's this guy here. These were put in because he wanted to have something a little different. He didn't like the bird baths, so he went over to England and he found some very old wellheads that would fit nice and give him a better feel to his gardens. He would have parties out here. He would enjoy his family out here. He would have massive parties inside of this. This is a better look of the colonnade. This colonnade here is just been refinished. We've just had construction done on it, so it's been all refurbished. Now has floor to ceiling glass. It's looking lovely. We are still in the process of rebuilding the gardens because of the construction. But you can see how he had it set up with chairs inside. He would have dinner parties where the tables would be inside of here, and the guests would be able to roam the gardens during the cocktail hour as they were able to enjoy the gardens. Here's a colorized postcard that we had found of an old one. This gives you an idea of the colors. You can see the water lilies and the plantings and some of the colors that he did have around the gardens. It's tough in black and white to identify exactly what is there. This gives us an idea of how he did have it. He was pretty strict on colors. I believe this color rendition is a little off because he was very monochromatic. He wanted only one color in certain areas. So one bed would have all the blues and one bed would have the yellows. One would have the oranges, those kind of things. So we think there's a little bit of poetic license that's been added to this one. And they gave us, just to give us an idea of what it was going to look like. He was very good at taking care of having his family over. This is his nephew. His nephew would come quite often with his sister. They would stay for weeks at a time, and he would enjoy playing with the kids and enjoying his family. He was a very big family man. It wasn't a large family, but they did enjoy themselves and were here quite often. So in 1932, once he was done living here, the house was reverted to the University of Rochester as their dean's house. And at that point, we know a lot of changes went on. We were coming out of the Depression. The U of R did not have a lot of money, and according to the records I have read, the dean and his wife decided to change the landscapes completely. When they changed the landscapes, this is what it looked like for the terrace garden. They had removed all the beds. They had gotten rid of all the paths. They got rid of the pond. They put in a reflecting pool. And this is how it looked for the next 30 to 35 years. This picture is out of the 60s, but it gives you an idea of how it was. They felt it was too expensive to keep those gardens up and to hire the 13 gardeners. And over the first 5 years that they took over, from 32 to 37, they reduced their garden staff from 13 people down to 2. Obviously didn't have the money or the manpower to take care of it. So this garden was completely leveled. With all of our research that we've looked at, all of the gardens were actually leveled, all the beds were removed, and everything was replaced with grass. So for a long time, this is how it looked. Depending on if you've ever been here in the early 60s and 70s, this is the way you would have found that garden. So in 1990, they decided to refurbish the gardens and put them back in the way Eastman had them. So here is a restoration. This is 1992. 2 years after they've restored the gardens, we have put back all the walkways. We have put back as many of the plants or the type of plants that he had. Again, we're back to 23 beds. This garden now contains 95 different types of perennials, including the wisteria that are on the grape arbor, or on the pergola, sorry. And you can see the pond is back. Interesting note on the pond is when they did go to refurbish this garden, they expected to be able to dig down and put in a whole new pond as Eastman had it. So they removed the reflecting pond and started digging down, and they came across the original pond. All they had done in the U of R time was take the steps out, throw them into the bottom of the pond, and fill it up with soil. So it was nice to find the original pond again when they did go through the restoration. 2 years ago, I completed a complete restoration of the pond because it was a 100-year-old pond that was starting to have some problems. We spent a lot of time and effort to rebuild it so that it's back to the original condition that Eastman had it in. This pond actually is a 10-inch thick concrete bowl that's 36 inches deep. And we've now replaced it with all the plant life that he had in it. We've also added goldfish in there just to keep some of the bug problems down. As you can see, it's a lovely garden. There is a lot of different flowers that are up. This garden was built to make sure that anytime, pretty much from April 1 to September, there are things blooming in every bed. It's nice, the early flowers come out. You see the irises come out fairly early. There are a few nice early plants that come in here all the way through to the fall when the anemones start blooming. We're about 2 months away from when that'll happen. So this garden gets filled up and is a very popular garden for us to have. A lot of people come through and see it. Some of the plants we have in there, this is a fern leaf peony. It's a type of peony similar to the Chinese peonies that you see in everyone's yard. But this is one of the earliest plants that I have that bloom. It's a gorgeous plant, but very ferny-like leaves, very delicate. By the middle of the summer, most of this plant is gone. It goes back and reverts and dies back, and then in the spring starts coming up again. You see the different types of colors. We've got gay feather in here. There are some garden phlox in here. You can see in the background Shasta daisies and some of the grasses that we grow in the background. On the walls of the palm house, you will see American wisteria. So in spring, we've got a lot of blooms coming up. This is actually the middle of summer when some of these plants come through. And you can see along the bottom edge that each of these beds is lined with boxwoods. It was a common practice back in Eastman's time to do that. They did restore them and put the boxwood line back in. In the last 3 years, we started having a problem. We have removed the boxwood at this point, and we will be replacing them in the next 2 years to give it back to that type, that at least the look of what Eastman had. Here's the pond and how it basically looks today. We have reestablished the yellow flowers that are in there. We have a secondary flower that comes up a little later in the year. It's purple, called Serratus stigma. This is a Lysomachia. It's a real nice little creeping plant. We do know this is one of them that Eastman had around the pond. As it grows, it will creep over the edge of the pond and sort of give you that draped look, almost have the capstones disappear. Some of the water lilies that we have. He originally grew only one type of water lily, which is the native for New York State. We have added a few more hybrids in there and now have some pinks. Some of the things we've added into the pond are elephant ears. We do bring lotus in every couple of years to give us something, another look to it. After a while, if you come year after year, you'd see the same thing. So we do try to make sure it changes as we go. Another one of the early flowers we have, these are oriental poppies. These are rather large. They end up being about 6 inches around, and it's a very popular plant for people to come in and see. At this point, the peonies are blooming. There's a lot of very early plants that are coming up at this point, and the gardens are just coming alive. You can see the boxwoods. This picture is from, I believe, 2010. Shows you how big the boxwoods have come. Typically, the gardens at Eastman's time and how they would build these boxwoods would never be allowed to be this large. They were supposed to be kept at about 6 inches high and about 3 inches wide, and they would replace them every 10 years so that they would keep them low. It's basically used to delineate the edges of the beds. They felt 15 years ago that they should have this higher wall to try and keep people from stepping into the gardens. But it became a maintenance nightmare with these. As they died out, as you can see in the space in the center, a shrub died out, we'd have large holes. Try to replace it, it takes years for this to grow. These plants here grow about a ½ an inch a year. So when you lose a plant, it takes a while to get it to come back. Excuse me. Right here, Stokes aster. This is a lovely one too, because we have both purple, white, and there's a red variety that we've added a little later in the year, comes up. It is not a true aster, but it does look lovely and looks almost exactly like an aster would. All right, the pergola. This is that large structure that was off on the right. This pergola here has got original George Eastman wisteria on the front of it. On the back of it, we grow fox grape, so that by the time the summer is here, the whole top is covered with leaf, and this becomes a very shaded area for people to enjoy, sit back, enjoy the flowers. Off to the right, what you see is what's called the VISTA. We'll be visiting the VISTA shortly. But the trees that you see right off of there are original Japanese maples that Eastman did plant. So from the terrace garden, we go on to what we call the cutting garden. Eastman did too. It's also referred to as the library garden. Now in Eastman's time, this is what it looked like. When you stepped out of the terrace and started walking north and on the property, you would walk into his rose garden. This rose garden, as you see, there are roses all along both sides. And this was a continuous path from the terrace garden to the rock garden. Eastman believed in having gardens in different places. The rock garden, which will be too soon, was considered a destination garden. As you walked his property, gave you a spot to stop and enjoy the flowers also. By the time the U of R took it over, this disappeared. So this rose garden, the arch you see and the benches within it are gone. All we have are pictures, and there is no way for us to reproduce it at this point. Because after our restoration in the 1990s, there was no space for this to be put. As I said, he loved to have his kids here. Here's his niece and his nephew enjoying running around throughout the gardens. Off to the right is that pathway. You can see the arch. Off to the left is the beginning of where he had all his vegetables. Now, Eastman's property was about 1/3 filled with just vegetables to feed his house. He had a staff of 33, and he fed all of them from the gardens here. The only thing he didn't raise was the major meats like beef and things that you would eat. Back then, there wasn't a lot of meat that was being eaten, but he did feed all of his staff through here. Excuse me. So in 1992 or 90, during our restoration, we reestablished the cutting garden. You can see in the back, those are the new archives and the new main entrance to the museum. And we established this garden into here. Rows of arborvitae in the spring, tulips, daffodils coming up. And then towards the later part of the spring, When the tulips are dying, we come back through and fill it with all sorts of annuals that are good for cutting, being able to fill any kind of vase you wanted within the house. And that's what Eastman used this area for, was to be able to have flowers, fresh flowers to be brought in every year. Now, this garden in particular is rather different. Most people don't realize this is a rooftop garden. No, it doesn't look like it. But below this area are the 2 levels of archives where we keep all the historic films. So this garden we're looking at here right now actually only has about 24 inches of soil for me to mess with. So we're very careful in here. If we dig too far, we put a hole in an archive roof. People aren't real happy with me. So we're very careful with this. This garden went through a fairly recent renovation. We're still in the middle of it because things had grown. This is 1992. This shows you how it looked before our renovation. Those small arborvitaes had now turned into 12-foot arborvitaes that needed to be sheared every year. But this gives you an idea of how the garden would look in early spring, lined with those tulips and lined beautifully so that we had a lot of nice color coming through. From the cutting garden, we step out into the vista. Now the vista, some people called it the East Lawn, is a piece of grass area that extends from East Avenue to University Avenue. It's a very long, expansive, almost promenade walking area that was very popular in the early teens and the early 1900s for people to have. Most estates were not as large as that in Rochester, so most of them didn't. But this was an idea that was becoming very popular, and Eastman felt he would want to have it. As you can see the house in the background, you can see part of the colonnade, and in the center, you can see the pergola. So we're looking at a little different angle. The 2 large trees are original elms. He loved elms, so he would have them placed all over the property. Nowadays, because of Dutch elm's disease, we do not have any of the elms left. Last elm was replaced in 2004, I believe. It finally died. Now this is how it looks today. You can see a lot of different changes in it. Those elms are gone. Those trees off to the right that are purple, those are the original Japanese maples. You can see that he had put them underneath where those 2 elms are. Those Japanese maples are growing. But now you can see a little better how much they've gone in 100 years. They've grown fairly rapidly, not super fast, not super tall. There is a plant right into the center of it. And if you take a look, I know I keep flipping back and forth, but it's easier to show you. There's a little post that you can see almost center. It's a very white post. That is the beginnings of a weeping mulberry. That weeping mulberry after 100 years is that shrub that's right in front of you, the tree that's right in front of you with all the scraggly leaves. It's one of my favorites because it's a completely abnormal looking tree, but it's beautiful in the spring when it's got the berries all over it, full of berries, and it's a rather nice tree to have in a yard. They're difficult to grow, but Eastman had put them in there, and luckily we have the benefit of them still being alive after the 100 years that he planted. Walking through the vista, there's a lot of lovely shrubs that we've added into here. There are 3 different types of magnolias to enjoy. Early spring, this area really grows out nicely, becomes very full of color, and then slowly through the year mutes back to all greens. This here I show because I love the sizes of the trees that you see right next to the pillar of the stairs. You'll see a very small shrub. It's actually not a shrub, it is a lace leaf maple, Japanese maple. It's very similar to the ones you see everyone putting into their yards nowadays, and they look nice and dainty, and it's a beautiful little tree, grows very small, very slowly. This is what it looks like today. This tree is now a whole 12 feet tall. In the spring, it is all green and lovely. This is what it looks like in the fall, almost a full waterfall of orange. But I try to tell people that a tree like this, after 100 years, has not grown much. So we're very delicate with it. We have actually closed that set of stairs off to traffic to make sure nobody walks by and damages it, because obviously if something happens to this tree, I don't have 100 years to grow it back fast enough to make it look as it does now. As we walk down the vista, we ending up at the north end of the property. And that's where we come into the rock garden. This, as I told you, was his destination garden. This is a 270-degree picture, so it gives you a little odd look at how this garden is, but it does give you a better idea of how it was built. This has a wooden grape arbor all the way around it. He did grow grapes off of it that were edible. We still have grapes upon it. And you can see the different beds that he has. Very dainty beds with small plants, rock garden type plants. These are the type of plants that bloom in the spring. So this is a very colorful garden in the spring, but come the fall and come the summer, it's pretty muted and pretty much just green. Excuse me. So as I told you, when the U of R came through, they leveled everything. They took all of these beds out. They took most everything they could off it. And this is how it looked. Everything gone. Pretty boring garden at this point, just a little bowl. They preserved the benches, they preserved the grapes, but that was it. All the beds were destroyed. Behind it, you can see some rather large trees, basically to the center right. Those are ginkgo trees. Eastman planted 4 ginkgo trees around the outside. These trees are now about 60 feet tall, and the 4 of them are still alive, and it does ring this garden very nicely at this point. 1990 again, we went through and started a restoration, and we started rebuilding those beds. This gives you an idea how that color is. This is very early spring. We do have the grapes around it. The ginkgos are still there. We have a couple of original shrubs we know that Eastman had, mostly lilacs that are there, but the whole outside ring was rebuilt also with a lot of these nice, colorful early spring plants. This gives you an idea of how it was in Eastman's time. You can see a lot of lilacs growing in the background. You can also see all those nice early spring flowers that are coming up. So we had a good idea of what he was planting. Some of the beds that are in there, okay, nice mosses. You can see some sedums growing, a couple of the different mustards, abresia, arabis, those kind of things are growing in the purples that are coming out. But this, like I said, was a very early spring type of garden. So if you come here in the summer, what you see is a lot of the greenery and not much color to it. It does come alive again in the fall, but this is one of those that's very early. But it was used, this garden was used more for people that were walking the property to have some place to stop and rest before they walked back. Figure you're walking it's about a half-a-mile walk all the way around the property. So it's a good walk on a heavy day. And you have to remember that back in Eastman's time, people didn't walk around in shorts. They walked around in wool pants, shirt, tie, wool coat. So it wasn't easy for everybody to be able to walk that far. Some of the other colors, this here is a maiden pink. It's a relative of the carnation that you see, or the dianthus. So they've rebuilt it very close to what he had. Some of the yellows coming through, some more of the mustards. Some of the flowers that I happen to enjoy that come through here. This guy here, it's called a pasque flower or a pulsatilla. Beautiful, very delicate early pink and purple flower that comes out. You have to look for it. It looks almost ferny, but it's almost one of those plants that can be grown in a small niche inside the garden. This is one that definitely shows me that spring is here once we start seeing this pop open. One of the more unusual plants we have in here, this is called a gooseneck loosestrife. For those of you that know about the purple loosestrife, this is a different plant. It is the common name of it. It is not the botanical name of it. But I love this flower just because of that nice delicate curl that it has, giving you that gooseneck look. Here's those maiden pinks I showed you. Looks a lot more impressive when you're right up next to it, but these are gorgeous because they end up giving you a carpet of that purple all the way across, or the pink, depending on which variety you're looking at. But it gives you a real nice dense color and stays real low. Very easy maintenance type plants to deal with. And I love this garden in the springtime because all that color is coming out. All those different plants are coming alive. And this is when it's at its most impressive, is in the early spring. Around the grape arbor, we have 3 different types of grapes. We have Concord, Delaware, and Niagara. All edible grapes. I encourage people as they walk through, they always ask, can I eat the grapes? Sure, have a couple of grapes off of there. If you can get to them before the squirrels and the birds do, you're fine. They can be sour in the early summer, but once they're ripe, they're actually rather nice and juicy. We just ask people don't rip down the grapevines, but they are prolific with grapes. It's covered right now where we're just waiting for them to come through and begin to start ripening. Now we're coming around and we're going to start heading back south on the west side of the building, and we're going to be heading for the west garden. Now the west garden and the west side of the property was built up in 1915. As I said, Eastman moved in 1905, and in 1915, he bought the property next door. It was called the Ross property. And it was a gorgeous house that lived next, that were people next door. It was very close to his mansion, and he felt he needed a little more space. So when he did buy the property, he had the house torn down, and he built this sunken garden, or the west garden. All the structure you see around here was built from materials they salvaged from tearing down the house. He was one to not waste, and they had this garden built out. This garden was designed by Claude Bragdon, a fairly famous architect in the Rochester area. Gave him a very nice little garden. Now the terrace garden was built mainly for his mother to be able to see from her bedroom. Eastman, we looked out of his bedroom windows, all he saw was the Ross house. So when he bought that property, he decided to put a garden into his view from his bed. One of the nice things about this is an interesting type of garden. It's called a contemplation garden. It's sunk about 4 feet into the ground. It's walled with all sorts of shrubs. So when you walk into this garden, you're almost walking away from the rest of the world. You're inside of almost your own little box of garden. Beautiful space to have, someplace to go sit and think, contemplate how the day went. So in 1917, the construction began. They've already torn down the house. What you're seeing here is the laying out of the gardens. In the background, you can see a rare picture of Eastman's greenhouses, because at this point, a lot of construction went on. He had been in the house for 10 years and decided he wanted to change things around, bought that piece of property. Remember back when we were looking at the early pictures of the terrace garden, you saw his greenhouses there. In 1915, he decided to move them all to the other side of the house. Here's a little better picture of him building the house. You're looking at University or East Avenue at this point. You can see the church from across the street. There's a house that's a little closer to his property, but the Robinson house wasn't a problem at that point. The Robinson house has since been bought, and we have turned it into a parking lot. I believe it was done in the 80s that we purchased that. So here's a view of the West Garden once it was finished. This is standing atop the loggia. That's the building that he had built. It is a 3-sided garden structure. Now, if you look, he's got it really nicely quadranted off. The shrubs are starting to grow in on both sides. Things are starting to fill in. And as you see, there's a very odd feature to the center of the house. The same time he built this garden, he determined that the inside conservatory of the house, which was square and contained his organ, wasn't proper for acoustics. At that point, he decided he wanted to turn that square room into a rectangle, better acoustics. He spoke to engineers. The engineers told him, that's impossible, you can't do it. One of the things Eastman was notorious for was he didn't take no for an answer. So he had spent about $400,000 to build the house, finally told the engineers we're going to do it. This move actually cost them double what he actually had paid to build the house. It took them 6 months to raise the left side of the house and move it. Took them 7 hours to move it. They put it on rollers and they rolled it 9 feet 6 inches just so he could turn that room into a rectangle. Like I said, the engineers said he was never going to be able to do this, and he didn't believe in that. This was a feat that nobody figured could even possibly be done. Estimation is that that part of the house weighed 2,500 tons. A lot of space to move and have to move that whole thing. So it shortened the gardens in the back. It changed a lot of the structure of the house. But as I said, he wasn't someone to have you say no to. All right, this is the loggia. This is the opposite side of that garden. This is where that picture was taken. You can see it's a lovely 3-arched little building. It was just a garden building to go sit in get out of the heat, be able to just sit and listen to the sounds that were around you. Luckily, back in this point, there weren't a lot of cars. It's hard to sit in here when it's quiet now because of the traffic that's on East Avenue. But as you can see from his bedroom, he would have been able to see downtown Rochester. So you see those tall, thin trees that are behind it, Bolian poplars. He had them put in because they grow fast. So now from his bedroom, he would no longer be able to see the city. This gave him that feeling of being away from everything and be able to be away from the city, not see everything that was in there. In the spring, his wisteria would start to bloom. You can see it blooming along the outside. This is a little earlier on, but he had flowers and things in these beds. A lot different than how it was remade, but this is how he liked it. He wanted perennials in the center. He wanted those shrubs along the edge so he could go walking through this garden, unbothered by the people around him. Excuse me. Back in the early 60s, after they took it over from the U of R, as I said, the garden was completely flattened, and that included the West Garden. They came in and put a new type of garden in here. This was designed by the original director of the museum back in the 40s. They had his wife come in and redesign the garden, put a pool in the center, put a little statue in there, and then beds of perennials around it. You can still see wisteria that's growing on the porte cochere, that covered driveway, Boston ivy growing up the sides of the house. But this gives you an idea of how it looked in the 60s. In 1984, it was decided they would redo the gardens to come back to what it looked like for Eastman. And this is what they settled upon. We've gone back to those same 4 quadrants. We've instead, for ease of maintenance, they decided they would edge each bed with yews and keep them sheared as tight as possible. And on the inside, put some low maintenance shrubs. Had the perennials been put back in there, because at that point there was maybe a gardener or some volunteers to do it. We didn't have the 13 gardeners that Eastman had, so this would have been a much more maintenance heavy garden. They've replaced everything else that was those center beds that were in there and put back in plants that could be usable and be able to keep this as that contemplative garden. In the center of it, you'll see a structure. It's called an armillary. This is a reproduction of an armillary that Eastman had originally purchased and wanted in the center of his West Garden. Had it placed there, didn't like it. And because he didn't like it, it got pushed off into a garden that would have been off to the left, a peony garden. I would have included the peony garden in this walk, but unfortunately we have no viable pictures left of that garden. It's tough to explain to people from memory what it is, so I keep that off. But that's where that went off to, and was kept there until the museum finally took over and were able to rebuild this, and that's when they brought this armillary back out. So here's the loggia again. You can see the armillary a little better. There's still original wisteria that are growing on there. You can also see the shrubs that are coming up. That's potentilla inside of the yew borders. And the grass and the outline of the bricks are all the same. What's interesting is people ask me, you watch people walk through this garden, and a lot of people want to stay on the brick and not on the grass. This garden, the bricks are there more or less for delineation of where things were, and not necessarily for walking. This is a garden where you should have been walking on the grass and not walking on the stone. Here's that loggia again in full bloom. This blooms like clockwork the last week of May to the second week of June, and is completely covered in these blooms. It's a very popular garden for people to come through in the spring. Again, very similar to the rock garden, a lot of blooming going on in the early spring, not so much through the summer until we get into the fall when the anemone and some of the other plants that grow in here start blooming again. And inside of this loggia structure is one of, I think, the favorite elements of this garden. This is the original fountain that Eastman had put in there. The fountain still does work. We try to keep it running as much as we can. Coming out of the mouth of the lion you see in the center there is a nice trickle of water. So when you're sitting in the loggia, you hear this nice little tinkling of water going on. Should we be having events in here, we usually turn it off so that it's not distracting. But if you come by any day when we're open, you'll be able to hear this noise. And it's beautiful just sitting in there. You can almost a meditative state sitting inside of here. I love sitting in it, listening to the noise. Some of the flowers that are inside of this garden, original tree peonies. We've done some tracking down of some things, and these peonies originally were donated back to the museum in the 1960s after the U of R had gotten rid of them. And this is one of the original ones that we did get back. Very lovely yellow. I happen to be a lover of peonies, so it does come through and look very nice in the spring. There are standard Chinese peonies in here also, but this is one of the more spectacular ones. Sides are completely covered with large shrubs of rhododendrons. So in the spring, as I said, this garden just absolutely comes alive. It's one of my favorites. One of the earlier shrubs that opens up is called Father Gila. Starts out with these lovely little white flowers, and by the end of the year, this is one of the best color changing shrubs that I've ever seen, because it brings out some beautiful oranges, reds, yellows, and some purples. Lovely shrub to have in anyone's garden. Now, obviously, this is a museum. We offer our gardens up for our visitors, but there are an awful lot of other things that we do use our gardens for. A couple times a year, we have what's called Garden Vibes. This is where we bring a band in that'll be enjoyable by a wide range of ages, and we invite the public to come out and enjoy an evening watching the band, enjoying the music and the fresh air in the gardens. Because of the size these has become, we have moved it outside of the garden onto the VISTA, but this gives people an opportunity to come tour the gardens and enjoy music as the evening's going on. So we put the bands up on a stage, people get to sit around, they bring their picnic lunches, they bring whatever they want, the kids get to come and run around and enjoy the music. Good couple hours to enjoy in the evening. A nice way for people to come back and just sit and enjoy. I love the evenings when we do this. We get a rather good crowd in here, and it's pretty well received by most everyone who shows up. We also use the terrace garden for an awful lot of events. This is an early spring gala that was going on. It actually was at the beginning when they had just rebuilt the garden. This is used very extensively for garden parties. People can rent the space to have what parties they like, whether they want to have a garden party like this. They can have hors d'oeuvres, they can do whatever, and they're allowed to enjoy all of the gardens at that point. Nice way for corporations or someone to have a decent gathering for people. The center of this picture, you see a very odd structure. What you see there are the covers for the English wellheads that we have in the garden. From October 1 to May 1, they're kept covered because we found that winter can destroy them. We're trying to preserve them. They're now close to 400 years old, and obviously nothing we can replace. We also find a lot of school groups that'll come through and do art classes. I see a lot of kids coming in with their art pads. I have adult people that come in there with adult classes, and they'll sit and draw and do what they, whatever they can do in there. We use it for a teaching tool and try to encourage school groups or other groups to come in and use these gardens in a way that would be beneficial to them. Now, this property, it's 11 acres now. It is staffed with myself and 2 other assistants, and we are the 3 that have to take care of this property. Now, that doesn't happen with a lot of help from volunteers. I have approximately 100 volunteers that step forward every year to help us out. This year being as it is, it's been a very strange year. Today is the first day I've been able to have some volunteers come back and help. I'm very welcoming coming back because this is a large piece of property. Wouldn't be kept up in the best shape that it is now without the help of these people. Remember, Eastman had 13, we have 3. But with these 100 people, they put in a combined amount of help for us last year of 5,300 hours. That's a huge help. That's almost 2 more staff people to help us out with what we have to do. And it is a monumental task. You can see they come in and help. For those of you who have been here for a few years, these 2 actually are not volunteers. They are the original head gardener and assistant gardener. These are the 2 people that I took over from. But you can see that you can see all the tools around it. We were doing a lot of work. We had to have help from our volunteers. So at this point, that's the end of our tour. I hope you enjoyed it. I know Nick will be coming back on to start administering some of the pictures. Please remember, none of these things can happen without the support of people. Any support you can give us would be great. Nick, are you there?
I am. Can you see me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great. Oh, 1 second. Can you hear me, Dan?
Yes, I can.
Oh, sorry, yeah, my computer's freezing a little bit, but okay, here we go. All right, so question came in quote normal times, are there guided tours of the gardens?
Yes, we typically run 2 tours a day from May to October. They're available. One is in the morning, I believe starts at 11, and there's a second one that starts at 2, I believe. They've changed the last couple of years. We're starting to revamp that. At this point right now, because of the COVID pandemic, all tours have been suspended. We're hoping to have them reset up again next year, but there are guided tours that take about 45 minutes to walk through. The docents offer a little more information on some of the architecture you will see and do discuss the gardens.
Who took over the garden after U of R? And is that when it got restored?
Okay, the U of R gave up the museum somewhere around 1942, and that's where the museum board of trustees was formed, and it actually became a museum in 1942. At that point, the house was being used mainly as a photography museum. The rooms were filled with cases. There was nothing but cameras and film cameras and different types of things you would use in photography. When you see it today, the inside of the house is filled out and looks like how Eastman had it. Back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it was just a camera museum, more dedicated towards Eastman Kodak than Eastman's life. In the 70s, they started looking at what they could do to turn this back into more of a living museum. And in the 80s and 90s is when they really revamped the property. The new part of the museum was built in the 90s. All the gardens were restored in 1990. And that's where we got to the point where we are now. And most of it came through in the 90s.
Are there any thoughts about bringing back a vegetable or community garden back to the property?
That's funny you should ask that. I've contemplated a few times. I've had discussions with some of the people higher up from me. I would love to be able to do something like that. One of the problems we have with that is because of the maintenance that we have to do on this property, to be adding more and more gardens would be difficult. This property is open. Okay, it's pretty much accessible 24 hours a day. We don't have fences like a lot of museums where you can't get onto the property. So to put in a vegetable garden, I would love to do it, but my concern is you'd come in, your vegetables are almost ripe, people are going to be able to come pick them, somebody comes through and just takes them. So it would be difficult. I would love to start a small vegetable garden to give people an idea of what Eastman did. His vegetable gardens were basically located where the main galleries and museum are now. So for me to try to reestablish what he had would be very difficult. I do have a lot of pictures of him. We've spent the last couple of years trying to identify what he was growing. We have a lot of seed orders so we can tell what he was growing. But to try and reestablish a community garden would be difficult, because then we have to worry about people coming on the property that are here visiting. Should something happen, there's liability issues that we'd have to worry about with that.
And how many gardeners work there now?
Right now, there are 3 of us. There's myself and my 2 assistants. I have an intern that I take from a local college, someone who is training in horticulture to give them a step in the right direction. And then again, my 100+ volunteers. But that's what it is, just the 3 of us.
Okay. So that was our last question.
Fantastic.
Thank you. So Dan, if there's anything else you want to address or.
I'd like to thank everybody that was able to come. I appreciate you coming and listening to it. Please come by and see the property. It's a lovely piece of property. Anytime you're walking around, if you happen to see me or any of my assistants, we all wear a tan shirt with the Eastman logo on it. We encourage people to contact us or talk to us while we're there. We love to talk to the visitors. We get quite a lot of questions there. I know there will be a follow-up email to most of you. I have asked that my contact information be put on there. I offer my service of answering any questions about plants that people have. One of the things I believe is educating people is the best thing I can do. So if you end up having a question and you want to find out how to get a hold of me, either go to the website and drop in a question, or you'll eventually get my contact information and feel free to contact me. But then again, thank you for everyone who was able to join us.
Okay. Thank you all. Hope to see you all next Friday for the next talk. All right. Take care.